I've been here for too long.
Okay. Kenji, I'm gonna make you co-host. Oh, actually, you're leaving soon, right? I'll make you
No,
co-host.
I can stay here until 10:45, 50. Would it be done around then? I don't know.
Okay, that sounds fine. Okay.
I have to come back. The first day class is like September 8th, we start early.
Okay, I think it's 10 o'clock Korea time, so I'd like to get started. Welcome everybody to Heterodox Academy's last forum of the semester on the Comfort Women's Scholarship Controversies. My name is Joseph Yi from Hanyang University, and I'll be recording this session. Now I'm going to share my screen. I think that's Kongyu. What? That's signed out? Oh, I don't want to sign out. How do I share screen? This one? Okay. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so why do we discuss comfort women issue? Again, speaking in Korea is the biggest issue that's dividing South Korea and Japan, promoting a future-oriented relationship. So the governments of Korea and Japan signed an agreement in 2015 for apology and compensation, but it was rejected by the next president, saying the Korean people are not, they cannot accept this emotionally. And then our most recently elected president, President Lee Jae-myung, has stated that, if you scroll down, that historical issues must be addressed if you're to build a truly future-oriented relationship. This is from our new president, Lee Jae-myung. Okay, my personal reason for working on this issue is because of my students. In 2012, Shreya, can you come up here? Okay. So I have another exchange student who's going to speak on their behalf. Okay. And she wrote this in 2012. A stranger.
A stranger spoke very ill of Japan when he found me talking with my Japanese friend on my cell phone in Japanese. Then he said, "Hey, damn the child of disaster, sly invader, go out from Korea as soon as possible." I shall never forget this word. The word disaster was too cruel. It was like a stab in the chest to me. Intellectuals should stop using this kind of harsh words because they have a big effect on people.
Okay, thank you. All right. And so this is a reason why we talk about this issue, because academic debates do have a big impact on both politics and also people to people. Now we have what we can say like two different perspectives in Korea. The dominant perspective is that comfort women's system was basically sexual slavery, another form of Holocaust. That the Japanese military kidnapped, enslaved, tortured, and mostly killed 200,000 Korean girls. That the current Japanese government hides or denies these facts, and views to the contrary reflect that of Japanese right-wingers and Korean collaborators. And we have many like television, movies that illustrate the dominant perspective. Now, the second perspective is what we can call revisionist, which emphasizes context, complexity, contingency. That it emphasizes that the Japanese military comfort women system did not happen in a historical vacuum. There's a long history of sexual exploitation, gender inequality, and in state sponsorship of sex work before and after the Japanese era. And so Lee Young-hoon talks about sexual exploitation during the Joseon era, and also how the government forced many poor women to serve as tribute women to China. After independence, you had the comfort women for the U.S. military, more up to like 200,000 to 300,000 who served the U.S. military. But again, this is not discussed in Korea. The second idea is contingency, that outcome is not inevitable, but is shaped by chance and agency, that winners write history. And so oftentimes we forget, like in 1920s and 30s, many Koreans wanted Korea and Japan to be unified, that many Koreans served in the military, both as soldiers and also as comfort women. But then Japan lost the war. And since then, we have a new group that has rewritten history. And so in the new history, basically you are either a traitor, you're somebody like Park Chung-hee, or you're victims like comfort women. So again, in the past, comfort women were seen as patriots who served Japan. Now they're seen as victims. Okay, and so for me as a scholar, I want to ask, empirical questions like how many comfort women and Korean comfort women were any abducted? Did the activists pressure, manipulate women's testimonies? Was the military hierarchy aware and complicit? How does the Japanese comfort women system compare to the comfort stations for US soldiers in South Korea and South Korean soldiers during the Vietnam War? And what are the formal and informal restrictions against this, talking about these kind of issues? I discussed different ways, two liberal approaches. So historically, liberals were like positive sum. That means we see a positive relationship between procedural rights and norms, such as free speech, objective scholarship, and substantive rights, social justice. But then other liberals are more zero-sum that think there's a conflict between let's say the freedom of victims, social justice for victims, and the procedural rights, the academic freedom of scholars. And so they would argue that victims' rights are more important than platforming denialists. Okay. And so I see this tension between positive sum and zero-sum academics. The zero-sum academics, they reject invites to debate denialists, or even to speak at any forum associated with heterodox academy. They pressure other speakers not to speak. Sometimes they drop out at the last minute. And they also sabotage job applications. Okay? Shreya, can you come and read this for us throughout? Okay, actually, Russell? Yeah, thank you. So my students are participating with me. Just a bold. Throughout
2015, Jason also became known on both sides of the Pacific for statements criticizing American historians of Japan and supporting Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's whitewashing of Japan's wartime past.
Okay, thank you. So this was in Jason Morgan, this is what Jason Morgan's advisor wrote, secretly. Okay, and so again, the purpose is to block the denialists. But then this is also considered like unethical. It violated Jason Morgan's procedural rights. I think the most unfortunate consequence is this pervasive self-censorship that few reputable historians are willing to talk about this issue. And the Korean government is not willing to talk about this issue. In 2000s, when a sociologist named Kim Gi-wook began reporting the South Korean, exploitation of women in the comfort stations, the government sealed the military records. They fear that Japan's right wing will use it to help whitewash its own comfort women history. Okay, now, so my personal case is I've been teaching this since 2012, and I got a lot of pushback from students and other faculty, and it has limited my teaching and career prospects. Okay, and you can see some of the examples here. There was a huge petition signed by basically everybody, including both physics and Department of German Languages. My German students were amused to see this. Okay. I want to end with a quotation from one of my students. Russell, can you come here? This is from one of my Korean students. On one side,
you have the mainstream school of thought that is currently in possession of the power and influence to shape the narrative. On the other hand, you have the peripheral scholars and supporters who provide alternative views to the subject matter. Most of these relationships have a pattern where, with a tad bit of exaggeration and dramatization included, the mainstream group either paints the alternative views as extremist and/or destabilizing, or simply outright ignores their claims, while the alternative group places themselves in a David and Goliath-esque narrative in which they are fighting against the oppressionist mainstream. This pattern exists in other similar controversies. The controversy on the DPRK involvement within Gwangju is also a prime example of the mostly one-sided debate.
Okay, thank you. So, so my student, this is from one of my students' weekly papers. And then I said that you can add right-wing examples, such as the debate whether Isaki planned an actual insurrection, or if a North Korean submarine really led to the sinking of the ROK Cheonam ship. Okay, now, I agree with you that this is a good example of the politicization of academia and asymmetric polarization, mutually isolated information bubbles. But what is the solution? For me, true academic freedom comes from bridging the bubbles and critically engaging different schools. In other words, do not see yourself as, we don't see ourselves as victims advocates, nor do we see ourselves as David. Okay? This is what Heterodox Academy tries to do with varying degrees of success. I am glad to invite panelists old and new with various perspectives and invite you, the audience, to critically engage. On a closing note, this is my 4-part definition of academic freedom: that you seek the truth, that you have the courage to seek and discuss what you think is true, and you have the humility, which is also courage, to the possibility that you may be wrong. Okay? And because scholarship and freedom knows no boundaries, you want to participate in a global community that promotes freedom anywhere and everywhere. Okay, thank you. All right, so that's my presentation. The second speaker is Kenji Yoshida, writer who has written for both The Diplomat and Japan Forward. Go ahead, Kenji, you have the floor.
Hi, thank you. Is it possible to share my screen, or is that not
Yes,
possible?
yes, anyone can share. Go ahead and share your screen.
Can you see it? Or
Yes, we see it.
okay. Is it full screen, or is this okay?
Yes.
Okay. So I think, Professor, you asked me to talk a little bit about how some academics are being silenced in a way when they do talk about these controversial topics like comfort woman. And some of the more popular, I guess, the well-known cases, I will start with Park Yoo-ha. I'm sure many of you already know about her case. She was a, a comfort woman advocacy group in South Korea called the Korean Council lodged a civil criminal complaint against Park Yoo-ha in 2014 for publishing a book called The Comfort Woman of the Empire, where in her book she sort of looks at different experiences of comfort woman. And Park Yoo-ha also had the chance to, somewhat of an exclusive chance to speak with former comfort women and share their voices in her book. And the Korean Council, the advocacy group, filed a complaint in 2014 alleging that in her book she tarnished the reputation of a former comfort woman. And Park Yoo-ha's case took many years. Her criminal case, the Supreme Court ruled last year, and she was freed, so exonerated last year, April. The Supreme Court ruled that her book did not damage the reputation of comfort woman. Her civil case is still ongoing. Uh, the trial court found her not guilty, but the appeals court, oh, actually, I'm sorry, the trials court found her guilty in the civil court, but the appeals court more recently reversed that decision, and this would probably go all the way to the Supreme Court as well. And there's also another a complaint that was filed by the Korean Council, the injunction against her book. So the Korean Council wanted her book to be sort of taken away from bookstores and not be published. Uh, and it the court that heard that case said it can be published as long as some of the parts in the book were redacted. And in fact, the current version of the book, 30 some parts of the book are redacted and it's blacked and published. And in order for Park to publish her book in the original format without the redacted version, she would have to win her civil case, which is, as I said, ongoing, and would go all the way to the Supreme Court most likely. And that's where Park Yoo-ha is at right now. I believe she's in the U.S. Doing some research. Her book was also translated recently in English. It was also translated into Japanese a while ago, and did very well in Japan, highly acclaimed in Japan. And another sort of more popular, more well-known case, I guess, is concerning Du Sok-chun. He's now a former professor at Yonsei University. He was indicted. Um, he was indicted in 2020 for some of his remarks that he made in his lecture, in his sociology lecture. He made some claims about comfort women. And he was also the group that filed a complaint against him is the same group, the Korean Council, that lodged complaint against Park. And so his case also took many years. He was criminally indicted. Also, a civil case was lodged against him. Uh, and early this year, February, uh, the Supreme Court ruled on his case, and there were three sort of main aspect of the case. Two of the comments that Liu made were found to be an academic expression. One, the court ruled that did in fact tarnish the reputation of former congressman, and he was fined for that comment. His civil case is also ongoing, and will take many years to for the Supreme Court. I believe it will go all the way to the Supreme Court, but his civil case is still ongoing. Uh, and just more recent example, which hasn't been covered by the mainstream that much, is a professor at Hanshin University was fired for his comments on comfort women and some of the more historically sensitive topics in South Korea, like the 1980 Gwangju uprising and the April 3rd, the incident in Jeju. Uh, this is the more recent case that I know of. Another case is a professor, and this is the more serious example, I guess, is a professor at Suncheon University was fired for his comments on comfort women and also was sentenced to 6 months in imprisonment. And I think this might be the first time that an academic was imprisoned for his or her comments in regards to comfort women. And there was another case, and Professor, you also met this professor from Kyunghee University, Choi Jung-sik. He was so some of the professors at his university in Kyunghee sought his resignation for his comments over comfort woman. He wasn't fired, but his uh, wage was cut for 3 months for his comments on comfort woman. And aside from comfort woman issue, as we all know, there are topics that are very sensitive in South Korea, and when you do speak against the conventional narrative, you tend to get into some trouble. And most famous case, of course, is Kim An-won, who does some really serious research on the May 18th Gwangju uprising, and he was jailed as well for 2 years. Uh, the case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and he served 2 years in jail. Uh, and just some other, you know, topics that are sensitive is, of course, how you evaluate Japan's colonial era. Those who tend to positively evaluate, who claim, for instance, that Japan did a lot for the Korean Peninsula in terms of its industrialization, in terms of its economic growth, tend to get into a lot of trouble for making those comments either in an academic setting or elsewhere. This is pretty recent case as well. A professor uh, is being criticized very much for suggesting that the colonial era was good for the Korean Peninsula. And some of the professors at his university has gathered seeking his resignation as well. Am I still doing okay on time? Just one last slide I have.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so just because we have a new president, there are talks of whether he would, start policing, different views. In 2021, when Moon Jae-in was president, he amended an existing law to criminally penalize those who make dissenting comments on the Gwangju incident. So anyone who makes a false claims, and whatever the false claim is, nobody really knows, but anyone who makes a false claim on the Gwangju incident can be punished by up to 5 years in imprisonment if you found guilty, or about $4,200 in fine. So these, and there were attempts to introduce similar laws against those who dissent against conventional views on the colonial era history. So, historical issues with Japan. That was never passed and the law was never amended, but these things could again resurface under the new president, Lee Jae-myung. And that's about it from my end.
Okay, thank you. I think the next speaker is Marie.
Okay, well, thank you. Now, maybe I will first start by sharing an interesting comment or the observation that I recently heard. And it's about the phrase, that's history. When someone says, oh, that's the history, then when Americans say something like that, then they usually mean, well, it's not relevant, it's not really important, right? Well, that's the history. But then when the Europeans say the same thing, they usually mean the opposite. Now, then what about Koreans? Well, Koreans' history for Koreans is almost like a life or death situation, especially if it involves Japan. Now, today I'm going to just briefly talk about this lawsuit concerning the comfort woman, which is still going on. The latest one was in April, just about 2 months ago. Now, a district court, the Cheongju District Court, ruled in favor of the plaintiffs. The plaintiff was the son of a former comfort woman, and so the court found for the plaintiff and ordered the Japanese government to pay 200 million won. Now, this was the third time that a Korean court has issued a ruling finding the Japanese government liable. Now, Kenji briefly already told us about the basic progress of the comfort woman litigation, but just briefly, now the very first comfort woman suit in Korea was heard in January 2021, and the Central District Court ruled in favor of a group of Korean women and ordered Japan to pay restitution. Now, Japan did not participate in the lawsuit at all. They did not answer the suit. Now, their grounds were, they said, well, compensation for the victims had already been settled in 2015. And also, this is a little more important, they said the Korean court had no jurisdiction over Japan under the principle of state immunity. So that was the very first case in January 2021. But then only 3 months later, in April, I misspoke. The first case was in January 2023. And the second case, 3 months later, in April 2023, in a case brought by another group of former comfort women. Now, the same court, the Seoul Central Court, but this time presided by a different judge, this time dismissed the case and rendering a decision completely different from the decision that had been rendered by the same court. This time, it said Korean court did not have a jurisdiction over Japanese government. And this time, because the defendant prevailed, now the plaintiffs appealed. So the next development was in November 2023. The case was appealed to Seoul High Court, the appeals court, and the appeals court overturned this decision and said, well, the Japanese military was responsible for abducting and forcing women to have sexual intercourse with the military, and thereby Japanese government violated international treaties. And at the same time, the Japanese government military violated the criminal law that was in force in the Korean Peninsula. So two issues. One was the international law principle of a state immunity, whether it could apply to Japan or not. But the appeals court said that because this is such an egregious human rights violation, state immunity doesn't apply. And also another ground was, again, the Japanese military violated the penal law, the criminal law that was in force. Therefore, they are liable. Now, again, the Japan never answered any of these lawsuits, so just a decision, appeals court decision was finalized. So this is now the law in Korea, and I think it's very unlikely that any different outcome will come out of Korean court. Well, how many more cases like this? Well, that's anybody's guess. And now with the election yesterday, what would be the Korean government policy toward Japan? I think that's an open question too. Now, I'm more interested in the judicial proceedings than politics, so I will just mention a few things from legal aspect. Now, we all know in any court decisions, we have a factual question and a legal question. And legal question here is, as I just mentioned, is the principle of state immunity. And then we see, of course, the question whether question about the role of a domestic court in international dispute. Now, in international law, this impartial enforcement of law by the domestic court is the ideal, but oftentimes we see the courts are not always completely detached from national policy, and it seems like it's a little bit, it would be naive to expect that a domestic court can resolve so-called historical dispute with a foreign country and with Japan for that matter, to the complete satisfaction of both parties. Now, what about the factual question? Now, the Korean court in these the cases have now accepted for a fact that the Japanese military kidnapped the Korean women and forced them to serve in its wartime comfort station, again in violation of international treaties. So according to the court, now these facts are established. Now a serious human rights violation took place. Well, the problem is, we all know that the courts are not normally very well equipped to find out what really happened many, many years ago. Koreans attach great importance to the past. However, not many, including judicial court, seem to be interested in finding out what really happened in the past. Now, some may say, well, history is the past. History should be best kept in the past. Well, true, but it does not mean that we can just forget about what really happened or what most likely happened, because historical grievances are legitimate, but still history, the historical truth, means more than, say, historical memories. Now, from my own research in the past, now I highlighted the dismal situations during the colonial period, during which that many poor parents were forced to give up their daughters. And I kind of made an allusion to the situation in modern Korea, modern meaning from 1960s, 70s, and 80s, when many young girls from the rural areas were sent to the cities to work as domestic helpers. Koreans call it shingmo, or to work at the factories. Anyone who grew up or lived in Korea during this time, as I did, knows what it is like. It was a way of many very poor families to reduce the number of mouths to feed. And during the colonial period, well, the situation was not very different, although, of course, the destinations for these poor girls from the rural area, for comfort, who became the comfort women, were much more troublesome. But the point is, the desperate economic situation cannot be just dismissed from the picture. Now, we can call it the market factor. The market has a gravity that cannot be easily resisted. And I think this is in part what Professor Ramsier wanted to remind us. So historians have a job to do to explain what really happened in the 1930s and 1940s surrounding the whole subject of the comfort woman problem. Blaming the Japanese military is easier, but it is still the scholar's job to find out, and if necessary, to put forward different or alternative explanations. If it can help the judicial court official findings of history wrong or at least inadequate in the face of a new evidence, a new perspective, well, so much the better. This is why a judicialization of the past is often dangerous, because the courts tend to favor a moralization of history in the name of justice. Now, some historians argue that any effort to question the official narrative are wrong because they dismiss the accountability of the Japanese Empire. But such a view is less than convincing because it simply amounts to disproving an argument that no one really argues. No reasonable scholars claim that the Japanese government or the military bore no responsibility simply because individual brokers recruited the women. And no one contends that operating comfort stations was perfectly fine simply because the public prostitution was illegal in Japan at that time. Now, by the way, one thing that is often overlooked in scholarly debate or the public debate is the fact that Korea was under colonial rule. Now, Japan has acknowledged that its military indeed captured the Chinese, or Dutch, or Filipinos in the wartime occupied territories in Southeast Asia and elsewhere, and indeed forced them into sexual labor. But the Japanese government has been notoriously, if you will, resistant to the account of the Korean victims of forcibly kidnapping and so forth. Well, that aggravates Koreans greatly. Now, but the fact is, Korea was Japan's colony. And unlike China, the Philippines, or the Dutch East Indies, the Korean Peninsula was not an enemy territory under Japanese military occupation during the war. But Korea was a part of Japanese Empire, governed under the imperial law codes. Koreans were imperial subjects. So the whole question of what kind of act or which acts were legal or illegal becomes much more complicated in comfort woman cases and also the forced labor, the compensation cases. Now, many Korean scholars today say that Japan's annexation of Korea in 1910 was illegal and colonial laws were unlawful or invalid. Well, arguing that annexation was illegal and void is like declaring that the colonization never happened and the entire colonial period must be deleted from history or from Korean history and also from Japanese history. But well, there is the problem of some inconsistency here. Now, in comfort woman cases, the court said Japanese military violated the criminal law in force in the Korean Peninsula. So this is assuming that there were laws and the Korean people lived under those laws. Well, compare this with the forced labor cases. In 2018, the Supreme Court put forward a very different reasoning. At that time, the Mitsubishi and the New Japan Steel, the defendant corporations, argued that they acted within the law of the time. But the Korean court rejected the argument, saying that colonial laws were invalid. Indeed, well, asking whether colonial law was legal, lawful, is, in my opinion, a kind of an oxymoron question. Now, some scholars argued that colonial law had no force because the people of Korea lived under foreign occupation. Now, frankly, this sort of argument is rather kind of embarrassing because it's like saying that the people without national sovereignty, like Korea at the time, are not capable of entering into any contractual relationship. And this sort of argument leads to, in my opinion, kind of unnecessary and unproductive, useless debate. Well, historical information is important. Historical ignorance is a serious problem. And oftentimes some people liken comfort women to the Holocaust victims. Well, but this kind of cheapens the Holocaust. And also, some scholars reject the use of the word comfort women, preferring sexual slaves. But this is not really entirely brilliant, I think, because bringing on the image of slavery is choosing a wrong vehicle. As you all know, slavery in history is a very sore topic in Korean history. Now, historians tend to shy away from studying this very troublesome topic in Korean history. But of course, it is something that must be fully confronted someday. And indeed, in the 1930s, the newspapers like 동아일보 or 조선일보 at that time deplored the situation in which the parents were giving away their daughters for a pittance, which they likened to slavery in Korean history, traditional the Korea. Now I'm getting to my conclusion here. Now, at a minimum, scholars or the historians must be left free to do their job. Kenji mentioned Professor Park Yua's case. Now, she has been cleared. She was acquitted completely in the criminal cases, and also she has been cleared of any civil cases too. If I remember correctly, I think it was January this year, in January 2025, appeals court found in favor of Park Yu-ha, and the plaintiffs did not appeal. So the case was finalized. So she is completely now declared, thank God. But well, still not much seems to have changed as far as academic freedom or the freedom of speech is concerned. Well, I mean, having watched her ordeal of many years, over about 10 years, not many people would be willing to stick their neck out to go through what she had to endure. Well, I've been criticizing the decisions of the Korean court here in these compensation cases, but now the Korean judiciary itself is in a difficult situation today. It has become a sort of a kind of whipping boy pushed around by the political branches. Whenever it seems like whenever the court renders a decision that you don't like, then you say, oh, these are arbitrary decisions by corrupt judges. Well, there was no judicial independence and so on. Well, of course, this is not something just limited to Korea. I mean, we see this elsewhere. I mean, US as well. But I think it's a trend that the public tends to call any loss for their side undemocratic, terrible, undemocratic. So there is a reason to be concerned about the future of Korean judiciary. Finally, well, getting back to history, well, maybe Americans perhaps need to be paying a little bit more attention to history. Well, maybe Europeans should pay a little bit less attention. Well, Koreans, I think, for Koreans, I think it's about time to get over history. I'm not saying, of course, that they should forget about history, but they need to understand that nothing in the past is so simple that it can be judged by today's standards, today's moral or ethical, and so on. Again, blaming history is easy. Now we can blame history forever, but it can go only so far because history is never a destiny, and it is simply something that we can build upon. And it is good to leave it that way. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the insightful words, Marie. Okay, next is Chizuko Allen from University of Hawaii. Go ahead, Chizuko.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Joseph. Can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you fine.
Okay, thank you. Wow. So yeah, I learned so much from Kenji and Marie. Yeah, so I'll be quick, hopefully. So I just want to make a couple of points here. The points are about the beginning and the ending, or not the ending, but the current situation of the comfort women movement, so to speak. Well, the movement led by the Korean Council, the Council for Justice and Remembrance, as they say, or it used to be called the Korean Council for the Women Drafted for Military Sexual Slavery by Japan, which was founded in November of 1990. Yeah. So one thing you notice about this movement is that it's not this organization was not founded to redress the victims, because there was no victim when the organization was established. The first Korean victim stepped forward only 9 months later in August 1991. Yeah. So what was this organization about? So I would say that it was a combination of many things, but basically an international feminist women's movement involving Japan and South Korea. That's how it started in the late 1980s. Yeah. So Professor Yoon Jun-ok of Ewha Women's University, and then she was doing research, trying to do research on comfort women for many years, and then she got this Japanese woman from Japanese Christian organization, Kikue Takahashi. Well, and so they started working together, and they tried to visit, Japanese sites and things like that. Okay, so that started in 1988 or so. And then around the same time, actually the Lee Woo-jung, the South Korean woman, she was the head of Korean Church Women's United, so the Korean Christian women's organization. So she was a leader of that. And in 1987, in Japan, when she visited Japan, she met with Shimizu Sumiko from the Japanese Socialist Party. And Shimizu was a member of the Japanese Diet as well. Anyway, so the Japanese Socialist Party actually started visiting North Korea in 1985. So knowing that, Lee Woo-jung, the Korean woman, talked to Shimizu and saying, oh, please, introduce me and other South Korean leaders to North Korea. I would like to go to North Korea. I would like to get to know, North Korean leaders, how is North Korea? And how are the people there? How was Kim Il-sung there? So Lee Woo-jung really asked Shimizu. Yeah. So they started talking, and Shimizu tried to help Lee Woo-jung. Yeah. So the end result of their conversation was this conference held in Tokyo and then Seoul and Pyongyang in 1991 and 1992. Yeah, so the women's conference called the Peace in Asia and the Role of Women. Yeah. And there is no minutes or clear record from this series of women's conference, actually. So we don't know what was on the agenda, but we assume that the topic of comfort women was on the agenda, one of the agenda items, because the founders of the Korean Council, Professor Yoon Jong-ok and also Lee Kyo-jae, so the founders of the Korean Council, they visited Tokyo, Seoul, and Pyongyang for these conferences. And in fact, in Pyongyang, so 30 South Korean women joined the conference in Pyongyang, and also they had an opportunity to speak to Kim Il-sung at that time. Yeah. But we don't know what was discussed. Okay. Anyway, so my point is that, okay, so North Korea, in fact, became a hidden leader of the South Korean comfort women movement from that point on. And North Korea actually provided the dominant narrative to the comfort women movement. Yeah. So just about that time, in 1990, 1991, North Korea was having talks with the Japanese government representatives. Okay. And they met in Pyongyang, they met in Tokyo, and their goal was to normalize the relationship between North Korea and Japan. And North Korea, of course, wanted some money, okay, not just apology, but also money to jumpstart their economy. Okay? So that was their goal, but there was no agreement made between the two. In fact, actually after 4 or 5 meetings. Okay. But then, after the final meeting in August of 1991, actually, the North Korean representative made a statement, okay, in front of the press and said, okay, okay, we suffer so much under the colonial rule. Okay, Japan massacred over 1 million Koreans. During the colonial period, several millions of Koreans were thrown into jail, executed, or taken for labor or military service. And then this North Korean man said, okay, hundreds of thousands of women were made into comfort women. Japan made several hundreds of thousands of women into comfort women for the war of aggression in the name of Cheongshing Day, body dedicating women's cause. Okay, so uh, this is from August of 1991. This is barely when the Korean Council was established, and the first, actually in the same month, the first South Korean former comfort woman stepped forward, and she made public appearance in the same month, actually. So you can see that there was a lot of coordination going on. And in fact, this kind of statement, okay, this became the foundation for the dominant comfort women narrative, in fact. And I actually noticed that this kind of narrative came from a long time ago. Actually, from 1960s, they made a very similar narrative about wartime mobilization, including women. Okay, so the narrative pretty much came from North Korea, and in fact, also as Professor Ramsayer, Mark, and Jason in their book "Comfort Women Hoax" also mentions a lot of North Korean connections, yeah, about the South Korean movement, okay, especially surrounding the former director, Yoon Mi-hyung. Okay, so that's what I think, or how I think the movement started. Okay, and okay, I'd like to just get back to today. Okay, so today I think North Korea has a different position now internationally. Okay, so North Korea doesn't want to have any interaction with South Korea because any interaction or North Korean people who get access to South Korean culture, economy, okay, they become too anti-North Korea. So they want to isolate themselves, right, from the world, and especially from South Korea. So they, as far as I know, they're not involved in such a movement today, not so much. But what I see instead is the involvement by China. Okay, so according to this article written by Professor Edward Vickers at Kyushu University, okay, he wrote the article 2 years ago. But okay, so China is actually appropriating the comfort women movement. So China wasn't truly interested in the movement for a long time, right? So therefore, Chinese women, as far as I know, were not part of the target for compensation in the 1990s when Japan started the Asian Women's Fund campaign, and tried to identify former comfort women, in several countries, and gave letters of apology and also atonement money. So Chinese women were not part of that, I guess, because the Chinese government was not interested in. But after Xi Jinping took over in 2012, so around 2014, 2015, China became quite aggressive in accusing the Japan's past about comfort women. Also, they started building museums, they started lawsuits, and they started applying for UNESCO Memory of the World listing, etc. So why now? Why is China appropriating the comfort women activism today? So yeah, of course, China is in a predicament, right? So anything to isolate Japan internationally will help, and especially to drive a wedge between South Korea and Japan, to weaken the U.S., Japan, South Korea security partnership. That's their goal, of course. And of course, long term, I think we shouldn't forget that they really want to target Japanese patriotism. It's kind of like a psychological warfare, I feel. They want to attack Japanese self-esteem, especially among the young people, so that they will lower their guard. They want to kill Japanese patriotism, especially among young people, so that if something happens, if there's a war, okay, Japanese would not even try to defend their own country. Okay, so that's how I feel. Okay. Well, thank you so much.
Okay, great. Thank you, Chizuko. And then next is Professor Mark Remzier from Harvard Law School. Go ahead, Mark.
All right, thank you, Joseph. What's the time? How are we doing on time?
I think we're doing okay. So maybe keep it like fairly short, 10, 15 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Joseph asked, I'm Mark Ramsire. I teach at the law school at Harvard. And it looks like it's too light there for you. There you go. Joseph asked how I got started in this. This isn't the sort of thing I typically do. I write about Japan, Japanese law. I do legal history and so forth. I had been working on another Japanese legal history project and came across this. There's a lot of evidence on the comfort women and the contractual structure under which they work. I mean, there's lots of evidence about the contracts that were being used, and I thought they were interesting. I had about 30 years ago done some work on domestic prostitution in Japan, and those contracts were ones where the women were, or their parents, it's unclear. My guess is sometimes it was the women and sometimes it was the parents, but they were paid up front. The women then worked a fixed number of years maximum. But if they only had an incentive to fill out the term, then of course they're not going to work hard. So the contract then provided that the brothel would calculate the revenue that they were bringing in, and if they brought in sufficient revenue, they could quit early. The comfort women contracts were interesting to me, just as sort of a footnote to history, because they had two predictable differences from domestic contracts. One is that there were more money, right? Which makes sense. If you are going to be working in Tokyo, you will that would be one thing. It's very, very unpleasant and very dangerous work. The pay is, of course, high. But if you're all going to be doing the same work in some godforsaken jungle in Southeast Asia, you are going to demand a lot more. And so they were higher. Also, you're going to want to work for a shorter period. So the maximum term in Tokyo was typically 6 years. For the comfort women, it was 2. And I thought those were interesting, and I wrote an article on this, which was all of 8 pages. It was a very, very minor article, and that's when all hell broke loose. Chizuko has done a really wonderful job of putting this in the international context and pointing out the really extremely important role that North Korea and now China has been playing in this. Let me add just one thing, which is that it's really, this is an interesting dispute for me historically, because this isn't something where the answer is sort of a little of this and a little bit of that. This whole thing is a fraud. I mean, it's just astonishing how very clear it is that this whole thing is made up. If you go back and look at the Korean newspapers, the Japanese newspapers from 1945 to 1983, there's virtually nothing about comfort women. what happens it explodes in Japan in 83, it explodes in Korea in 89. What happened? There's this very obscure fellow in Japan who wanted to be an author named Yoshida Seiji. In 1977, he wrote a book that he said was his memoir. And he said he was sent by the army to Korea to get some Korean women to work as comfort women. So he said, you know, I lied to them about what they would have to do. I told them it was, I forget, you know, working on as nurses or something. So I defrauded them and signed them up. And nobody bought the book. You can get it in a library like Harvard's, but it was a complete bomb as a book. So in 1983, this same Yoshida Seiji published again a memoir, but this time he said he was told by the Japanese army to go get some Korean comfort women. So he went over with a platoon of soldiers who drew their bayonets and found young women, tied them together, took them 4 or 5 kilometers away, and then raped them all, and then sent them off as comfort women. This book sold massively. And not only was it a bestseller in 1983, the largest, I guess, or the most respectable, if you will, newspaper, the Asahi Shimbun, picked it up and ran with it and ran over a dozen stories about this fellow's claims, Yoshida Seiji's. Now, the professional historians, particularly military historians, were bothered by this because the details weren't right. These are military historians who followed the way that the Japanese Army and Navy worked in World War II, the chain of command and the jurisdiction and so forth. And the way Yoshida Seiji described it just didn't sound right. So they started checking. And they went over to Korea and they interviewed people at the towns where Yoshida Seiji said he dragooned women, and nobody remembered a thing. There was a very local newspaper, Korean newspaper at one of these places, and it did the same thing. Nobody remembered anything about Japanese soldiers coming in with bayonets and dragooning a dozen women. They said, look, this is crazy. We'd remember it, which of course they would have if it had happened. So the historians kept at it, and one of them in particular would phone Yoshida Seiji from time to time. And in the late 90s, I believe it was, he died. Before he died, he basically admitted he made it all up. This was all a story that he invented to sell books. The Japanese Asahi Shimbun newspaper, eventually, it took them a while to do this, but it checked all of the stories again, sent people over to Korea, and there's no evidence of this. So they retracted all of the stories that were based on Yoshida Seiji, said, look, this sex slave story, there's absolutely no evidence. And so the notion that, in 2021, people would attack me for talking about the contract structure just had me completely blown away. I couldn't believe it. Chizuko pointed out that this stuff starts in Korea in 1991. And of course, the Korean translation of the Yoshida Seiji book comes out in 1989. And so, yes, the basis of this is in a fraud by a Japanese author that was then translated into Korea and then was picked up by exactly the group that Professor Allen talked about, namely this North Korean aligned group that is doing what it could to drive a wedge, as Professor Allen put it, between South Korea and Japan. And then this was picked up by China. Let me add one footnote to Professor Kim's very nice summary of the litigation, which is that, yes, this is in part about sovereign immunity, which is a very basic concept, and it's nothing controversial. But it's also that Korea and Japan signed a basic treaty in 1965, in which Japan paid an enormous amount of money to the South Korean government, and in exchange for which the South Korean government agreed to waive all claims that it or any of its citizens would have with respect to any claim coming out of the war or the pre-war period, and to the extent that there's any factual basis for the forced labor, which I haven't looked at, but that would be covered by this 65 treaty as well. So thank you very much. That's what I have to add.
Okay, thank you, Mark. And then hopefully Tanya will be our last speaker. Go ahead,
Yeah,
Tanya.
I'm just sharing my screen. Is it visible?
Yes, I see it.
Okay.
Yeah,
Um,
maybe we can enlarge it so we can, but we can see it.
okay. I can try enlarging it, but if
This
it's
is fine.
possible,
Go ahead. Yeah, this is
yeah.
fine.
Okay. Yeah. So, hi everyone, and thank you for giving me this opportunity. I'll be talking about, as my topic suggests, a comparative analysis of systemic sexual exploitation in British colonial India and the Japanese military's comfort women system. Why I chose this topic is because Indian literature and the sociological literature particularly really talks about this realm, and their main focus has been on economic and political colonization, but not the way women were traded and abducted for various sexual purposes. So I got interested in concept of comfort women very recently when I started studying for my other sociological exploration and paper on historical exploitation of women, and got really interested in asking whether it has any similarities with the Indian past at all, the comfort women system itself. So to begin with the brief basic understanding from where my paper would be aligned, systematic sexual exploitation is what I'm trying to look into for the basis, and it's far from being an incidental aberration of colonial and military enterprises. Frequently functions as an integral, though often deliberately obscured, mechanism of domination and control. So within such regimes, the exploitation of women's bodies serves to assert power, dehumanize subjugated populations, and reinforce entrenched hierarchical structures. Colonial powers and military regimes across history have demonstrated a consistent interest in regulating and exploiting the sexualities of women, and recognizing it as a potent instrument for social control and construction of dominant identities in enemy regions. So the very act of systematizing and regulating sexual access, whether through containment or containment policies or military brothels, indicates a level of acceptance and integration of exploitation into the apparatus of governance or military strategy, moving beyond mere opportunism to a calculated component of maintaining power over the vulnerables. So here I undertake a comparative review of the systems that enable the sexual exploitation of women into two distinct historical contexts. One is British colonial India, and the other one is Japanese military's comfort system during World War II. So the objective is to scrutinize these systems through a comparative lens, focusing on their organization, nature, extent of state involvement, prevailing legal and social frameworks, the influence of economic drivers, and the enduring consequences for the women and communities involved. While I acknowledge the overtly militarized and centrally organized nature of the Japanese comfort system here, this analysis posits that analogous, or if often more diffuse or economically intertwined, systems of sexual exploitation were to be seen were also features of British colonial rule in India. So I have labored some of the grounds in my comparative analysis. So first, I'll be talking about primary locus of exploitation in both the cases. While the Japanese system was characterized by its overt centralized military command of sexual slavery, British India witnessed state-regulated prostitution for its military alongside more diffuse forms of exploitation deeply intertwined with colonial economic policies. The nature, scale, and organization would be like this. So the Japanese comfort women system was unparalleled in its vastly bureaucratized network of sexual slavery across multiple occupied nations involving hundreds of thousands of women. It was explicitly designed, as my fellow presenters said, implemented and managed by the Imperial Japanese military as a matter of policy. But in British colonial India, particularly, the system of regulated prostitution within contentment uh, was also significant in scale within its designated zones and was formally organized by colonial authorities. This system involving licensing and medical checks of women who were participating in these kind of prostitution was geographically confined to areas with a substantial British military presence, but was widespread across the subcontinent wherever such garrisons existed. Beyond these cantonments, other forms of sexual exploitation were more diffuse and less centrally organized by the state as a system of sexual servitude. So there's one component that I'd first like to address. There's the state military involvement, which can be direct command versus indirect commandment and facilitation. So the Japanese military's role in the comfort women system was one of the direct command and comprehensive control. Military authorities were involved in policy formulation, recruitment, transportation of women, and the establishment, management, and regulation of the comfort stations themselves. In British India, state and military involvement in cantonment prostitution was military direct, regulatory, but also economically indirect. So to give examples, first I'll be talking about the nature and extent of this kind of containment policies, regulated prostitutions. So during British rule in India, a significant system of sexual exploitation was formalized through containment policies and the regulation of prostitution, primarily for the use of British soldiers. The enactment of legislation such as the Act of 1864, Containment Act, and various Contagious Diseases Acts institutionalized these practices. These laws facilitated the establishment of chaklas, which is brothels, within all near military cantonments, where a designated number of Indian women, often around 12 or 15 per regiment, were kept for British troops. These women were typically recruited from rural families in many instances and were licensed and paid directly by British authorities. So the primary motivation behind this regulated system were multifaceted: to provide a consistent sexual outlet for soldiers and to maintain military discipline and morale. Some colonial justification even suggested that access to prostitutes were necessary to safeguard British soldiers from engaging in homosexual behavior, which was seen as un-British and perverse, in contrast to perceived natural same-sex practices among quote-unquote inferior colonized people. Furthermore, prostitution was seen as means to alleviate boredom among soldiers and reinforce imperial dominance through the sexual control of Indian women. So this system involved the compulsory registration and intrusive medical examination of women suspected of prostitution, who were often branded as moral transgressors or vectors of diseases. So about the role of local collaborators in facilitating exploitation. So there was a vastness in Indian subcontinent, and the relatively small number of British officials necessitated that they include some of the locals here. So many of the local landowners were supplying women for sexual exploitation outside this formally regulated containment policy system, and for these purposes or other than prostitution, catering to soldiers to profit in their unquote and unquote free time. There was economic subjugation and the genesis of vulnerability as well. So there were a lot of economic policies implemented by the British in India, systematically dismantling existing social economic structures, leading to widespread poverty, indebtedness, and famine. This economic prostration directly fed into systems of sexual exploitation as women. They were actually stripped out of traditional livelihoods and facing dire circumstances that were often forcing them into prostitution and became susceptible to other forms of social sexual coercion. So there was an impact of land revenue systems and taxation and deindustrialization as well. uh, British colonial economic strategies were heavily focused on deindustrialization and fiscal maximization, which led to implementation of exploitative and revenue systems that imposed taxation on peasants, for instance, often without regard of any crop yields or ability to pay. Land was transformed into a social mobility. Social mobile commodity, which was subjected to eviction and sale if revenue demands were not met in full. Peasants were frequently forced to borrow money or at exorbitant rates to pay taxes, which led to indebtedness from which escape was nearly impossible. There was famine, debt, bondage, and increased vulnerability of sexual exploitation as well. So the economic hardship endangered by British policies was frequently compounded by recurrent famines too. And historical accounts, for example, one from Bengal state famine in 1943 revealed that significant number of women were forced into prostitution at that moment, simply to survive and feed their families. And military personnel, both British and Allied, were often the clients in these desperate exchanges. It became a direct tax for sex system where sexual services were systematically accepted as a form of tax payment, or where women were routinely requisitioned from tax defaulting families by the British military personnel as well as tax collectors for sexual purposes in a manner analogous to a comfort women system, although there is a very rarity of such comparison in literature. Many being teenager daughters and their early 20s mothers, they were subjected to brutal rapes, sometimes for a week, ranging from 10 to 15 serves a day for the British personnel groups. Due to the social stigma attached to rape, many of these victims preferred suicide or burned themselves alive instead of coming back home. Many, due to the trauma came through the extreme physicality of these rapes, died on spot. It is quite similar to what comfort women's concept suggested in Japan. So the system preyed on the vulnerabilities of young women here as well, particularly those experiencing poverty, displacement due to war, and the hardships of colonial occupation. False promises of good pay or the opportunity to support their family were made, and these were the tactics used to lure unsuspecting victims. Many came from rural backgrounds with little to no education at all and belonged to lower social economic strands and classes, rendering themselves particularly susceptible to deceit and coercion. There was a constant rape that was compounded by extreme physical violence, including beating, stabbings, burning, and torture, particularly if they resisted or refused these soldiers' demands. The lack of adequate medical care led to the rampant spread of sexually transmitted diseases, unwanted pregnancies, forced abortion, and stillbirths. There was a particular interesting case of Devdasi system as well in colonial rule in India, which was an ancient Indian practice involving the dedication of young low caste and class women and girls to be dedicated to temple deities. But British policies saw this as a way of sexual exploitation itself, and they undermined the power and wealth of local kings and temples at that moment, who were the traditional patrons of Devdasis. So these women lost their primary means of support and social standing, making them more economically vulnerable, and their roles were more susceptible to exploitation. They were stripped of their recognized place in society, which was very respected at that moment, but it was stripped out. And with limited alternative economic opportunities, they were left no choice but to join commercial sex work to survive, an outcome ironically at odds with the stated aims of some reforms that were happening in the Indian states. Even the status of women in traditionally respected performing arts, such as courtesans and temple dancers, eroded significantly as they were also deemed to be common with prostitutes, and their practices stigmatized a lot. The legal framework itself was very ambiguous regarding prostitution itself. Um, so coming back to the comparative analysis, the legal and social responses to sexual exploitation also differed significantly. So the Japanese comfort women system was a system of direct military force, not subject to any external legal oversight that might have offered protection of rights to the women or other than that of contracts, which were also very binding and a lot worse. British India, in contrast, had explicit legal frameworks that were designed not for the protection of women, but for the control of diseases among soldiers and the maintenance of colonial order. It was one that primarily served colonial interests and contributed to the stigmatization and control of exploited women. So the key economic drivers here, despite the differences in the overt organization and directness of state command, economic vulnerability emerges as a crucial enabling factor in both the Japanese comfort women system and the various forms of sexual exploitation in British colonial India. It seems in territories occupied by Japan. Poverty and economic desperation, often exacerbated by the conditions of war and colonial practices, rendered women highly susceptible to deceptive recruitment tactics promised through work environment and having an income, which ultimately led them to comfort stations. There are accounts of families facing extreme hardships, selling their daughters into these systems. In British India, particularly, economic subjugation was arguably a more pervasive and foundational driver of widespread sexual vulnerability. So the colonial economic policy systematically impoverished large segments of the Indian population, leading to chronic debt, landlessness, and recurrent devastating famines. This ruined directly and forced countless of women into these kind of prostitution brothels as a means of sheer survival for themselves and their families. This shared
Tanya,
yeah,
sorry, we only have like maybe 10 minutes left. Do you want to wrap it up with a
yeah,
closing
yeah.
statement? Okay.
Yeah, surely, surely. They also faced a lot of social ostracism and marginalization, and this extended to their children's and families, intergenerational cycles, etc. And they also faced stigma. They were often viewed as dishonored, tainted, and spoiled. And if they come at all, they didn't want to go at all to their homes. So there was a fight of legal redressal as well, but in British colonial India, particularly, it was more diffused, embedded within ongoing struggles against caste based violence, marginalization of communities who historically involved in sex work, and broader issues of gender inequality and poverty, many of which have deep colonial roots, but it was not directly focused on women's sexuality and their sexual exploitation in British colonial India. So the conclusion is that. This analysis itself revealed that while the manifestation of such exploitation differed in organization and scale, both contexts unequivocally demonstrated that instrumentalization of women's bodies as a tool of imperial and military domination is still pertinent in these contexts. In both historical settings, it served not only for immediate gratification or troop morale, but also broader strategy for asserting dominance, dehumanizing the other, and enforcing the racial and gendered hierarchies inherent in imperial and material projects. Here I stop. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right. So do we have maybe 10 minutes for questions? Do we have anybody from the audience who who have a question or comment? Okay. If not, then Russell, can you come up? So, yeah, I see a couple of new faces like Yasua, Kohara, Julian Lee Meyer. So we'd love to hear from you. But go ahead, Russell.
So I had a bit more of a general question. It doesn't directly have to do with comfort women themselves, but about the Korean volunteers in the Japanese army and auxiliary units. So comfort women are usually depicted, and rightfully so, as victims of the Japanese Empire. Even those who voluntarily sign contracts with the Japanese Empire are seen to do so under coercion or because of material conditions that would and poverty. So, but are the same sort of explanations applied to, or sorry, I'm getting a bit lost, but are the same sort of things afforded to depictions on volunteers for the Japanese military, specifically with Korean men? Because in Indonesia, our volunteers for the Heiho and Gyugun were not really depicted as collaborators. Although I'm not sure if this is the case in Korea or other forms of media or not. I'm just curious on that.
Oh, I see. Right. Yeah. So that's an interesting question. So there's a lot of discussion. We have a lot of discussion about the women who served, but how about the Korean men who served? What is the public discourse on them? Do we just ignore them? Do we see them as traitors? How do we treat them? Okay. Does anyone want to tackle that or share your thoughts? Okay, or maybe that can be food for thought for everyone.
Yeah.
Okay. Jillian Lee, do you want to say something? You want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi. My name is Jillian Lee Meyer. If you can't tell, it's dark here. I'm in Indiana in the US. I'm part of Heterodox Academy, and I saw this in an email they sent out. And I was really interested in it. I study moral psychology, and so I'm really interested in cross-cultural morality and how that differs throughout cultures or between cultures. My question is like kind of a general one of it seems and like I have a very like basic overview. This is my first time hearing anything about this, but it seems like there's a difference in how Japan and Korea and maybe China like in what they think actually happened in history. And if you have that fundamental difference of what actually happened, how do you find a way to reconcile something like this?
Okay, thank you, Jillian. Does anyone want to tackle that? Like, how do you reconcile, like, when people have such different perspectives? Yes, go ahead, Mark. Mark, okay.
I do it the same way we do. I would like to think we do anything else in the academy. I write a book about it, and that's after writing an article and or two or three, I guess. Yeah, I mean, I think we do it. It's an extreme form of something that's just very basic to academic exchange.
Sure. Building on that, what Jillian said, I heard a criticism that, Mark, that you spoke at the meeting of the Japanese LDP, the Liberal Democratic Party. And so I think the criticism was that you're letting your work be kind of politicized by others. So first of all, did you speak to the LDP and what do you think about that? About the politicization question?
It was a committee in the LDP. Yeah, I've talked to them. If Hillary Clinton wanted to talk to me, I'd be happy to talk to her too. I'm not picky.
Okay, sure. So you're not worried about the weaponization of your research by like right-wing groups?
I think this is all very skewed. I've never heard of any colleague of mine being criticized for speaking to a left-wing group. This weaponization is in the American Academy is entirely one-sided. I talk to whoever wants to listen to me.
Okay, thank you. I also see other faces like HA, and then HA, do you want to say hi? Okay, maybe not. Okay, I had a couple of students, so come on up. Yeah, this one's here. And
Hello.
introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name's Megan. I'm a full-time student here at Hanyang from America,
Okay.
from the US. I grew up in Florida. I had a question for Professor Mark Ramsier. It was from the introduction of your book, which you read as part of our readings for our class. You mentioned something about how the official narrative about the comfort woman takes away their agency and kind of ignores the choices that they might have made. And in doing so, you kind of say something along the lines of it kind of takes away their humanity. So I was kind of curious if you kind of link someone's amount of agency and humanity. I was kind of wondering what your connection between those were and how someone's having a choice, having agency or not having agency is connected to their humanity.
Sure. You picked a part of the introduction where I used more obscure polysyllabic words than I think I really ought to. I mean, what I'm trying to say is what this story, and this is really Park Yu-hat really put this best. So I'm really following her, but I think she has it right, which is these are very poor women, most poor women in Japan and most poor women in Korea did not choose to become prostitutes, but some did. Maybe, whether it was a wise decision or a bad decision or an appalling decision or a terrible decision, it's one that they made, some of them. right? Some of them are sold by exploitative parents. And one of the frustrating things about doing this research is I haven't figured out how to tell the difference. It's it seems to me it's a crucial thing for somebody like me doing this work to try to figure out how much of these are women who chose themselves, how much of them were they basically pushed into this by their parents. Maybe there's some other pressure some places too, but those are the principal ones. But when you say that when this official story says, no, these Korean women were dragooned by the Japanese army, it's taking away from these elderly women who had a very hard life, the chance to present themselves as they were. They made these choices. And this sex slaves story takes that away from them.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, anybody else? Yes, come on up and introduce yourself. One of my students is coming up. Also, Jillian, I think it's important that we as academics, we're seen as straight shooters. We're not political. And then as for me, I try to speak to everybody, progressive groups, conservative groups. I write for them. And so I want to be seen as somebody who can be who tries to do his best, who tries to follow the facts. And I think that's all we can do. We can do our best. Okay.
Hello, my name is Luis. I'm an exchange student here at Hanyang. And a lot of the critique that... From Germany. Mm-hmm. And we read some articles critiquing that one original essay that you had. And a lot of the critique was about misrepresentation of citations and sources. And then in your book, The Comfort Woman Hoax, I believe you said that you did not perceive the responsibility to accurately represent the sources that you were citing. And I just wanted to kind of ask you to maybe clarify that, or if your opinion has changed, because especially since you are a scholar and a professor, I was wondering why it is that you didn't feel the responsibility to have to accurately represent those citations.
I'm very bothered. I certainly didn't say that. And if you read it and got that impression, that really bothers me. No, of course I have to accurately present the citations. Absolutely. Those criticisms about the citations, they were almost all bogus. I mean, they were frankly outrageous. And in the book, I go through the ones that are substantive. Basically, this is the quintet of historians who decided to write a 30-page attack on my 8-page article. But there were three. I made 3 mistakes, and I'm sorry. That said, I only made 3 mistakes, and I think most professors, if they're honest, would say, if I only make 3 mistakes in an article, that's probably pretty good. I mean, we are human, but no. Certainly the goal is 0 mistakes. I made no mistakes that made any difference, but absolutely it counts. It's my job to get it right, and yeah. And so I'm sorry. So I lost my temper at this fivesome claiming that I made 30 pages of errors, which I didn't make.
Okay, thank you for clarifying.
Okay, thank you. All right, is there any other questions or thoughts from my students or anybody from the audience? Any final questions or any final words from our speakers? Okay. Anyway, Jillian, I hope you found this informative. Okay, and so as I mentioned before, I try to speak to all groups. I try to invite all groups. I've been inviting people like the Japan Studies Portal to come and debate for the past 3-4 years. They keep rejecting me, but I will always invite everyone to speak. Okay, you can so you have the right to reject, but I will always invite you. Okay, on that note, I'd like to give everybody a round of applause. Thanks for coming. Thanks for speaking to us. Okay. Thank you for another great forum, and I hope to see you again next year. Okay. Okay, good luck. I hope none of you goes to prison, especially me. Okay. All right. Thank you, guys. Bye. And then for those in Heterodox Academy, I hope to see you in New York. Okay. Thank you, Marie. Thank you, Kizuko. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Justin.
Okay. Thank you,
Take
Chizuko.
care now. Yeah, take care.
care.
Yeah, don't go to jail, please.
Yes. Okay. I'll do my best. But, okay. Thank you, Marie. Chang Dae Han. Oh, and Jay's still here. Okay. I'm leaving now. Thank you.